Hey mom, hey friends, my name's Payton and welcome to Script Tips episode number 1. Today I want to talk about environment variables in Node.js. So what is an environment variable? An environment variable is essentially a global variable that's accessible throughout your application and it's configured ahead of time, so before the application runs. Typically in these environment variables you pass configuration values, so database credentials, port numbers for your server, and stuff like that to configure your application. You can also pass other values if you want, but mainly it's used for configuration. So right now I have an empty application, an empty project, and I'm going to create a new index.js file so we can test out these environment variables. In Node.js, environment variables are accessible on an object called process.env. And that object is always there. It's configured before the application runs and it passed into every node application. So you can do something like console.log process.env and we can see what we get. So if I node index.js, I get a bunch of junk. And this is just some stuff that I configured for my terminal. And you might have some stuff in yours as well. It probably looks different than this, and that's okay. These things aren't useful for us at the moment, but let's move on. So in order to pass your own environment variables into the application, there's a couple ways to do that. We could specify it on the command line as we're running our node command. So we can say env equals test node index.js. And this value, this process.env object right here is just like any other object in JavaScript. It's not special. So you can actually access values on it using the dot operator like this. So this will access this env variable that we're sending in. So if I save this and run, we should be able to console.log test. And we do. It works. However, if I specify my environment variables this way, I have to do that every time. So if I run node index.js, it's no longer there. So I have to again specify env equals test node index.js to be able to access that. You can see that get pretty annoying. So there's another way of doing it that's also annoying, but it's a little bit better, and you can export your environment variables to the command line like this. So what this does is essentially store this environment variable inside of your terminal session. So now if I run node index.js, I can see this test value is there. The problem with this is that it is stored inside your terminal session. So if I open a new terminal, if I close that one and open a new one and run node index.js, it's not going to be there anymore. So I have to specify it again, export it, env equals test. You know, you can see how that just gets really annoying every time you have a new terminal. So there's an even better way of doing it that is recommended, and that is to create a .env file. This is just typical standards for applications. You have a .env file, and inside of here you can specify your values. So env equals test. So if we run this, we'll actually not get anything, unfortunately. And that's because Node doesn't know how to process this env file. What we could do is write a process that looks for .env files, reads it, exports these values to the command line, and runs the application. But that would be a lot of work. So typically, when there's something that I have to think about that I don't want to do, I go to npm, and luckily there's a great package for this, and it's called .env, but it's spelt out. So without the actual dot, it's .env, and we can install that .env like this. So this is just a package that makes it super easy to read environment variables. And all you really need to do is require .env and call this config function. And what .env does is it looks for an env file at the base level of your application, and it'll export all those variables. So if we run it now, oops, I forgot to save it. Okay, if we run it now, we can see that it read our file and it exported this test environment variable into our application. So now we can access it. So that's super cool. And one thing I'd like to say before we go along is that you want to make sure you add this .env file to your git ignore if you're going to commit it. So I'm going to make a .git ignore and go ahead and add it. And the reason is a lot of times you specify values that are sensitive, so secret values, API keys, passwords inside of your .env, and you don't want to commit that to GitHub or any repository because people have bots that will scrape GitHub and pull any secret values and try and hack your database or your accounts. So just be very careful about that. Make sure you add it to your git ignore. And so now if I git status, I can see that my .env file is not in here because I have it in my git ignore. So please do that if you're using environment variables in a .env file. Okay, so moving on. With this .env package, there's actually some cool things that you can do with it. Instead of having to access process.env like we're doing here, we can actually pass this into a value. So we can say something like const results equals require .env, and we can console.log results. And if we run this, let's see what we get. So it actually loads all the environment variables into this object that has a parse value. So we can actually further dive down to this, and we can const envs equals results dot parsed like that. And now we don't have to write out that whole process.env.whatever. We can just access it from this envs variable. So that's kind of nice. It just makes things a little bit easier throughout your application. So there's an even better thing that you can do with .env that's really nice. In a lot of cases, you don't want to clutter your application with these packages like .env. I mean, this takes up 5 kilobytes. It's not that much, but in some cases, if you're running production applications, all of these bytes matter, and it makes a difference over time. So what you can do is actually preload these environment variables using .env inside of your node command that you run your application with. So unfortunately we can't do this results equals require.env if we do it this way. So I'm going to have to go back to doing it the old process.env.env way. And what you can do is call this require flag inside of your node command -r, and then specify the package that we're requiring. And so .env config like that. And then we can call our index.js. And now we can see that it did load our environment variables from our .env file, and it exported them like we're used to. The benefit of doing this is, like I said, if you have a production application and you don't want to clutter it, I mean, the problem is you do have to run this every time. But if you're running a production application, you usually only boot your node server one time and it runs from there. So it's not a huge deal. But yeah, so let me show you another couple of use cases about this. So a lot of times inside your application, you can use environment variables to go down different paths. So if we have, if we have an environment variable, say, in this case it's test, but what if we had one that was production? So what if process.env.env was equal to prod? We'd want to do some stuff. This in prod. Obviously you can do something more useful. This isn't useful at all. And then we could have else So this, I just want to use this as an example to show you that you can use environment variables to run your application a little bit different based on the environment you're in. So we can just use these conditional statements to check what environment we are in and run some code based on that. So if we run this again, we can see that this is in test. But now, I mean, if we wanted to go back and if we were in a production environment and wanted to run our prod code, we could just change our environment variable value and run this, and we can see that it's in prod now. So that was just a couple tips on environment variables and how to use .env. It's really useful. It's really good to understand. It's a pretty important part of application development, especially in Node. So if you can get a good concept, a good grasp of this, it's super helpful. All right, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good day.